So I did a review of this movie about a year ago, right after it came out, but so much has happened and I've watched it so many times since then, I wanted to revisit it. 2021, The Suicide Squad. I can't stop thinking about this movie and the things that I would like to say about it. I'm going to try to keep this from being too long. The Suicide Squad is everything that 2016 Suicide Squad was not. It had the elements that the original one had that were positive, and it fixed all of the things that were sort of wrong with it. So full disclosure, I have watched it at least 25 times. I stopped counting. I own the digital copy. I love this film. So if you didn't love this film, you're probably going to think I'm an idiot. If you hated this film, you're probably not going to watch beyond this point. I love The Suicide Squad. And then rather than go into all of the things I love about it, I want to talk about a few major points. Narrative structure. The story that we're given makes consistent sense. This is the thing. It actually took me a couple years after Justice League and watching the Snyder Cut and a bunch of reviews before I realized that was the whole problem with Justice League. The script was terrible. This is the problem, not the details. The whole story needed to be reworked, ultimately. And the narrative direction of stories is something that is horrifically lost today. The new Star Treks, the new Disney Marvel, the new Disney Star Wars, all of this fake regurgitation, this intellectual property necrophilia of digging up and raping the things that we used to love in the past. The chief characteristic that you see in it is it makes no sense. There's no consistent narrative. There is no canon. There's no need for canon. And there's no character development. Your characters are all scarecrows. They're straw men put into the screen to represent something in your mind ideologically. So somehow or another, making a character black and transsexual, that's their character. They're black and transsexual. That is not a character. Them being black and transsexual tells me nothing else about their life. If you're Miss Marvel, well, there's not a lot of brown superhero girls from Jersey because you never read any comic books and didn't know about all of them that came before you and were magnificent and you will never live up to. But the idea of making that's her identity. Not your parents are murdered in an alleyway and you are raised by Ra's al Ghul to become a great vigilante like Batman. No, it's, well, I was a brown girl living in Jersey. That is nothing. It's empty, it's vacuous, it's meaningless. All of the modern woke writing does this. They don't know how to make a character. They only know how to check boxes. Now, this is critical because, yes, I talk about that in a lot of my videos. But what we see with the Suicide Squad, people are not just there to check the boxes. And again, in sort of a classical, liberal, what Hollywood's always done sort of fashion, of course, there's a diverse group of people and there's a diverse world in which they live and all sorts of things. We even get the weird sex reference with the thinker when they threaten to put a rat in his butt and he says, my answer might not be what you would expect. But it's delivered in a way that's funny. It fits into the story. And the narration is such that the characters are important. They have a past. We learn about their past. We see them bond. They bond progressively in a way that makes sense consistently. Someone with emotional intelligence and life experience beyond 5th grade wrote this script. And you can see that from the beginning. But beyond that, it is also artistically brilliant, visually brilliant. We get a great story, but we get all these visual connections and callbacks. We get the guy whose head gets sliced at an angle during the opening scene in the battle on the beach. We get to see Jotunheim when it is cut, it is split, and when it's exploded in the same exact angle. There's these cool visual callbacks. And yet the movie itself, it is serious, it is dramatic, it's also funny. It's hard to even describe. Now lately I have been in a retro fashion finally reading the Superman, the Death of Superman, Reign of the Supermen, whole story arc. I'm back. I've started the series of the Return of Superman in the comics in the 90s. I wasn't reading them then, but I've been reading them now. And that has really been noticeable. Reading those and rewatching The Suicide Squad, there's a lot of crossover. They feel the same. It's the DC universe, post-Crisis on Infinite Earths, working its way into the 90s. And some of that you see in The Suicide Squad with the way chapter titles or story titles or directions are sort of given in the imagery of the movie. The blood in the water forms something, the smoke forms something. They do that in those comic books in the 90s. It seems to have been a DC thing. And it works on the screen to give you this connection. And it feels comic booky, and it does from the beginning. It feels like when you can get the Javelin, the Weasel, you get all these. We begin with Savant. The movie begins with giving us all of these random characters. And again, it's cool. Because if you're my age, you remember many or all of those characters from the comics, but they were relatively minor. I mean, you knew them, you read the little entry in the Who's Who comic, but you didn't actually see them anywhere. But suddenly they're on the screen, and you're like, Javelin? Javelin's in the live-action movie. We don't ever learn about Javelin. He's got an accent. We don't know why. It's not clear where it's from. There's no backstory. Again, there's no Batman Begins 3-hour origin story. You don't need it for these characters. They're there so that people like me can be like, that's cool. And people that don't remember them are like, that's cool. That you randomly assembled all these characters and you get a little bit of detail about them. They're going into battle. And even though the movie isn't a direct sequel, clearly Suicide Squad took place before this. They kind of reference it. Captain Boomerang and Harley Quinn know each other, etc. So you get this group of characters, and then you're like, well, these are our characters? And you're wondering what's going to happen. And of course, you get the great payoff that almost all of them die. They were a diversion. The other team is a whole other group. We end up getting this incredible degree of the comic book characters brought to life. We get to see it in a way that is both humorous and tragic. It's fun, and yet it's meaningful. And that sort of really sums up the whole rest of the movie. Ultimately, we get characters that mean something, but part of that is the main story arc. And again, this is artfully done in a way that great literature does it, and great films of the past have done it. That may sound like a grandiose statement for the Suicide Squad. The movie is really all about patriotism and the nature of patriotism and human freedom. And we do get, as I say, we get a diverse cast of characters. Amanda Waller is fabulous. She's good in both movies. She's straight from the comic book. She happens to be a black female that works for the U.S. government in this high-level position and is so devoted to her cause that she will lie, steal, kill, you name it, anything to defend her country. That's something they would never put a black woman in that role in CRT. It would have to be somebody that was a white male and portrayed as all bad. But Amanda Waller is a black woman, American patriot, but her willingness to do anything to anybody makes her this mixed bag, where you kind of understand her if you're a patriot, but you also don't. Where you're like, yeah, you crossed the line here. It gives us a lot of nuance. And the same thing happens then with Bloodsport, with Flag, with Peacemaker, getting to see the different ideologies of Flag, the patriot that wants to tell the truth about his country because honesty is more important than any of that. Peacemaker, who's willing to murder any number of people and do other things I can't say here to defend his view of liberty, and will murder to keep the reputation, the truth under wraps, and protect a fictitious reputation. Bloodsport, the mercenary, who has been in special forces, but is a criminal who has tried to kill Superman, as we learned at the beginning. But ultimately, he is left tasked with doing the right thing and figuring out what the right thing is for his team, for the country, and for the future. It's also included in everything that happens in Corto Maltese. Having a family of corrupt people that ruled that as their personal kingdom for so long, the revolution, and Luna being this freaky dictator in waiting and Harley Quinn abruptly killing him, which is really brilliantly done. Harley kills him when you don't expect it, like you're expecting him to be the big bad, and he's just suddenly dead. And the thing she says about emptying those horrible thoughts out of his head, this is brilliant. And then it moves from him, so from the corrupt family to Luna to a full-out general that still wears his uniform and is militaristic, who ends up dead, and another general that sort of is in charge right before the revolution. That whole story is also about nationalism, patriotism, human freedom, and where the balance is. And if you've watched it as many times as I do, you pick up on these nuances in the story. Getting the background of Ratcatcher 2, who would have ever thought that Ratcatcher 2 would be a huge character? And I love the way they did that. That was straight out of the Who's Who comic, to just call her Ratcatcher 2 like they do in the Who's Who encyclopedia of DC characters and places and storylines. To just have that be in there. And we do get her origin story the way we get Bloodsports talked about, Polka Dot Man talks about his, but we get Ratcatcher 2, we get to see sort of the flashbacks. And that, again, it ties in with the rats, the lowliest of the creatures, the things that they're everywhere. Everywhere, not far from us, just below our feet are rats, because that's how it works. Her power ends up being phenomenal to be able to call and command the rats because they're everywhere. They're the lowliest creatures, and yet we walk over them like they're not there. And so her power, I think that's why we get more of her origin story. It ties together with that theme, whether it's Waller, Peacemaker, Bloodsport, Flag, that patriotism, the government of Corto Maltese, and how patriotism versus freedom works out, and seeing it in the life of Ratcatcher 2, whose father, they lived free on the streets, like bound by no one because they were homeless, but he was completely in slavery to his addiction, and he dies in it. But the rats are the things that save the day and liberate the world. This is phenomenal stuff. Also, they fixed the problem with Harley Quinn. Yes, she's in it, and she's once again a feminist icon, and I don't mind that. They did not over-sexualize her, I felt. I mean, obviously, they treated her as a sex object. Luna wants to marry her, and, they parade her around a little bit. But the movie isn't Harley Quinn and the Suicide Squad the way Suicide Squad was Harley Quinn and Suicide Squad. She's not the primary focus. She ends up being, her and Flag are the two linchpins from the first diversionary maneuver that tie in with the rest of the cast as they meet up. But they're important to the story, and she is important to the story, and she gets the arc with the javelin and weirdly, comically trying to figure out what purpose it should serve. But it doesn't make the movie all about her, nor is everything about her about sex appeal or fetishization. Instead, she comes across as comic relief and humor and drama. I mean, the scene where she kills Luna because of his his willingness to kill kids is actually quite brilliant, and she's a great actress, Margot Robbie, because she bounces around and does that whole, she's believably Harley Quinn, the Harlequin, having been deranged by the acid and mutated by the Joker. She's believably emotionally all over the place, and yet, again, the degree to which she makes a lot of sense really is part of this whole theme of what is patriotism, the powerful versus the little guy, what is the right thing to do in these contexts, and the movie fills all this in. And it gives us great sort of sub-stories. King Shark, who's done wonderfully by Sylvester Stallone's voice, learning to trust him, getting him to be part of the group, and you become fond of him, but we never do get his origin story, only that, legend says he's descended from a Hawaiian shark god or whatever. And Polka Dot Man, Polka Dot Man, one of the silliest characters, and I don't remember, other than the entry in Who's Who by DC, I don't remember ever reading a comic he appeared in. And to be willing to put him out there, and again, he's flamboyant, as he says his own, we get the idea that he's gay, but guess what? That's not the main point of his character. His character is not all about who he wants to have sex with. He's got mother issues because of his mom and what she did to him and his siblings. And he's got this incredible power, which is simultaneously goofy and silly and looks ridiculous and, as he says, flamboyant, but is also very powerful and very useful. And we see, from what we could tell, unless they do a comic book trick on it, Polka Dot Man dies saving the day. He becomes the superhero his crazy mom dreamed that he would be. He comes to grips with it and helps stop Starro right before he gets squashed by Starro. So we get all of these brilliantly, when you can slap this ridiculous number of characters on a screen and some of these really ridiculous characters, King Shark, Polka Dot Man, Ratcatcher 2, and you can make it this meaningful. I mean, Ratcatcher 2 is one of my favorite superheroes ever. Now I follow her on Instagram. It's insane. But the character is written so well, the story comes through so well, and she does such a phenomenal job, Daniela Melchior, of playing that role and emoting everything. And you're in love with that whole story of how she comes to grips with her dad's life, both the good and the bad, and now she's seeing him as she's helping to save the day, the thing that he would have wanted her to do. And it's a fabulous movie, but it's well written. It comes together visually, artistically, the dialogue makes sense, the callbacks to earlier things, and at the same time, the humor of things like Milton. When we get the little side story about Milton gets killed, who's Milton? Because these movies always have somebody you don't remember that dies. And for them to spend a couple minutes on Milton and the fact that we didn't remember who he was, that was just really cool. It's really well done. And in the end, I'm glad I have the digital copy, because I don't know how many times I will watch it. And give me another year and it'll probably be approaching the number of times I've watched The Watchmen, which says a lot, because that's my favorite superhero movie of all time. So even though it came out to mixed reviews, and so I'm sure a lot of people aren't going to agree with me, what did you think? I love The Suicide Squad. It's a callback to an earlier era of filmmaking and adventure filmmaking, even without it being about superheroes. I mean, this plot going to Corto Maltese to save the day and stop the monster. I mean, this is all, take away the alien monster aspect. It could have been any Schwarzenegger or Stallone movie in the 80s, really. It's a callback to an earlier sort of model, but it gives us all this stuff to ponder on the spectrum of patriotism, loyalty versus rebellion, human freedom versus governments. Just amazing stuff. The Suicide Squad.